Hello, listeners. Welcome to another edition of the Makdisi Street Podcast. I'm Sari Makdisi and joined by my brothers Osama and Kareem. We don't have guests this week. We're just doing a roundup of some of the current news that's been taking place this week, locally and in the Arab world as well. And we're going to begin with a discussion of an event I'm sure many of you have been following, which is this a protest that took place outside of a synagogue here in Los Angeles. The initial coverage of the protest basically made it seem like pro-Palestinian protesters just pitched up outside a random synagogue in LA, and it was quickly represented as an anti-Semitic incident. And then the mayor of Los Angeles, Karen Bass, quickly issued a denunciation of the anti-Semitism of this incident. And then the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, doubled down and said what's happening is an outrage. And then President Biden doubled down on his double down to say it's an outrage that this house of worship, and what if why, how dare anybody protest like outside a house of worship? And here again we go with the raging anti-Semitism in the U.S. And of course then all of the usual sources double down on the double down to say, oh, it's a scourge of anti-Semitism and so on and so on. It turns out, of course, that that's not exactly what was happening. Rather, that the protest was there to rally against the proposed sale of land in Palestine. I think we can share the screen here at this point, actually. And you can see the ad here. Now's the time. Real estate in Israel, of course, from a Zionist standpoint, that means everything from the river to the sea, of course, right? So the mega event of the year is coming to North America, and there's two spots in LA. One is in the Valley on June 20th, and one was the other day here in the center of the city, outside the inside the Adas Torah synagogue. And the ad says, come and meet representatives of housing projects in all the best Anglo neighborhoods in Israel. Get the most updated info from the experts so you can make your move. So it's obviously trying to move people to occupied Palestine and to obviously to sell land in settlements and other places, and anyway, certainly illegally expropriated Palestinian land, and above all, with that the moniker of the Anglo land. It was weird. So there's several things to be said about this. One thing is that the idea of advertising land for Anglo land, let alone Anglo neighborhoods, whatever, Anglo neighborhoods. I mean, just to advertise a neighborhood as Anglo in 2024, if you were doing this to buy or sell land in the U.S., it would be completely illegal. Anybody, by the way, if you ever bought a home or land or whatever in the U.S., you'll get documents going back to the basically to the Stone Age that say any reference to race or ethnicity and so forth, because there used to be laws in the U.S. that said, you can be in a certain neighborhood, not allow Black people or Jewish people or whoever to live in the neighborhood. And of course, that's all now completely illegal since the Supreme Court outlawed it in the 1960s. But the point is that these people, Zionists, can still pitch up and say, oh, we're offering you land for sale in Anglo communities, which is a very nebulous term, especially in 2024, in occupied Palestine, all of it expropriated Palestinian land, of course. And so, the interesting thing here is not just that they're selling this land in Anglo communities, but also that what was a protest against the illegal sale of violently and illegally expropriated Palestinian land at a synagogue in LA gets misrepresented as a protest against a synagogue per se. And then, as usual, all of the usual suspects jump onto the bus, and now they're denouncing. And there's a picture of Karen Bass here, also down the street at the Simon Wiesenthal Center, the Museum of Tolerance, also on Pico Boulevard, same neighborhood, basically. The Museum of Tolerance, for those of you who don't know, made notoriety around the world by opening a clone of itself on the biggest, the most important Muslim cemetery in all of Palestine. They literally had graves exhumed. They destroyed this Muslim cemetery in order to implant what they call a Museum of Tolerance. And I mean, I've written about this in my last book, and it's the sort of story that couldn't be invented. And so here they are. Here are these people up to their eyeballs in just horrendous crimes against humanity and everything else. Here they are now wringing their hands about the terrible onslaught against against innocent synagogues in LA. So I don't know. What do you guys make of the story? It's kind
Well,
of
what I'm
amazing.
just looking at now at the New York Times. I mean, this is the first I heard of this was yesterday, of course, and when a reporter approached me, and I had not even heard about this. Now I'm reading the New York Times, which, of course, we should always take with a grain of salt. But it says, and I'm quoting from the New York Times, it was unclear, or in this case, demonstrators were protesting a real estate fair at the Adas Torah synagogue, where attendees were invited to meet, quote, representatives of housing projects in all the best Anglo neighborhoods in Israel, end quote, on Sunday afternoon. It was unclear whether some of the property sales being promoted at the event were in disputed territory that could make them illegal under international law.
Here we go. The New York Times could be. It might be. I mean, the criminal says it's not illegal, so therefore, well, that's just as valid as the International Court of Justice saying
You
it
can
is.
see, and
Who
Karim, you can
knows,
see
right?
how, again, the editors in the American media and the Western media, they've been doing this for decades. They keep changing words, keywords. For example, disputed as opposed to occupied. It's not disputed. There's nothing disputed about the West Bank. It's clearly in violation of international law. It's clearly, as is East Jerusalem, these are occupied territories, as is the Golan Heights. But they keep using the word disputed to make it sound like, well, you say this, I say this, and it's somewhere, it may be, in violation of international, it's completely in violation of international law. If in fact they're selling property inside the West Bank, in settlements, illegal settlements in the West Bank. But the point is, I mean, what I'm struck by, Sadi, like you, is the term Anglo neighborhoods. It just seems so bizarre. Now, maybe in LA, I don't know. Do you guys in LA use that term?
No, of course not. It's as I said, it's completely illegal. You can't advertise the ethnicity of a neighborhood. It's complete. If you did that in LA, there would be riots practically because
But you're saying at a time, of course, with all the redlining in U.S. history, there was a time when, of course, you did do this, correct?
of course, and some of the victims of this sort of redlining were Jewish communities in not just in LA, but also in LA. But around the U.S. So yeah, this is part of America's history of racial segregation and so on. And obviously, it's not like racial segregation is no longer a thing in the U.S., but legally, it's no longer a thing, at least, because the Supreme Court outlawed those kinds of covenants, as they were called, for housing back in the 1960s. So it became, maybe even before the 1960s, certainly by the 1960s, it was completely illegal. So, but here we go, and of course, we all know about the history of racial segregation in all of occupied Palestine between the river and the sea. It's an ethnic state. There are there's tiny areas where Jews and Palestinians can live, in the same city. For example, they call them the mixed cities.
But let's not spend too much time on this because it's pro-Palestinian groups criticize that characterization, i.e., that it's anti-Semitic, defending Sunday's demonstration and arguing that protesting an event at a synagogue was not inherently anti-Semitic. Why would it even be inherently? Why would it be even, possibly? I mean, even the word using the word inherently is again this they like disputed inherently. They keep using this language to moderate. It's the same way they cover what's going on in Palestine. So anyway, I think enough of this. Let's find out more about the. I mean, as I said, this is the first I'm reading about this. If this is true, what I'm reading, it's kind of shocking,
Yeah,
honestly.
it's shocking, and it's now it's, of course, all of the usual suspects are feeding this into the larger narrative about the spike of anti-Semitism in the U.S., and the ADL and similar organizations are beating the alarm bell.
So, Sadia, that brings us to the question of if given. I mean, this is the bigger question to segue to Karim and to the whole to what's going on in Palestine and Lebanon as well. Given this kind of extraordinary sort of reflexive coverage that always that has a pre-built narrative, right? There's an established narrative. There's anti-Semitism, and of course there is anti-Semitism, but this is not. They're talking about they're using constantly conflating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, and not even that actually we should start changing the language and start saying it's really any of us who defend or anyone who defends Palestinian freedom or Arab freedom or liberation at all in any way, shape, or form is always reduced to being anti-Semitic. So you're always having to defend yourself from these charges. The question then is, given this kind of given this discourse, how does that change? That we've had now 9 months of genocide that's been live streamed. So, Katie, maybe you want to think about this or help us answer this. 9 months of genocide, and yet here we are in where are we now? June 25th, and it's as if nothing has changed.
Well, I don't think that's true, Osama. Nothing has changed in the
Yeah,
mainstream
in the main. I'm
press.
talking about the mainstream. I'm not talking about actually on the ground. I'm talking about in the mainstream. Anyway, I don't know. I mean, this is
Yeah,
like it's
yeah.
almost as if we're beating a dead horse. There's just nothing to be gained from pointing out the I don't know, the obvious.
Okay, now we're all depressed about this, but the question, so you're saying there's been no shift in the way it's received? So if the mainstream press keeps repeating itself and is on the offensive, I mean, do people see it differently now in LA and wherever these things are taking place?
Right, and that's the point. Anybody who relies on the mainstream media for their information about what's going on in Gaza, and I assume therefore anywhere else in the world, like yes, there's particular reasons why they would lie about Palestine, but I suppose therefore, if we can't trust what they're saying about Palestine, then who knows what they're saying about anywhere else too. But certainly, I think that's part of what's going on. So the explosive growth in different media outlets around, each devoted to different, areas of the world or whatever, is hugely important. That's how, especially how young people get their information, which is why young people are not drinking the Kool-Aid that older, not to generalize in terms of age, but just in terms of how people who get their information. If people who rely on the LA Times and the New York Times or CNN or the Washington Post or whatever, not to mention Fox, if that's how they're framing their view of the world, they're completely out of touch with reality. And it's younger people tend to avoid those outlets and therefore they don't necessarily automatically have better access to the news. And of course, that opens up the problem. Well, where do you get your information from? Which is something we could talk about at some point. But yeah,
So let me ask you, both of you, since your I think your semesters or whatever they are terms have ended recently. What's going on with the encampments? Is anything? I mean, is it sort of broken for the summer, and then the idea is it comes back in the fall, or is there an expectation that this is it unless something dramatic happens? Or what are the expectations? Do you have any?
I think it depends on each university. Kadim is different. I mean, yes, you're absolutely right. We're now, at least at Berkeley, we're in summer recess. I mean, there is summer school and all that, but in general, the students the encampment is over here for now. But it's almost certainly going to, not necessarily the encampment as an encampment, but the protests and the solidarity movement with Palestine and with Palestinian freedom is going to continue. That's my guess. That is my very strong sort of bet that it is going to continue because it's touched something. It's a generational shift, and people can see, and they're deeply unhappy. They're mortified by the kind of racism and denialism, and the Israeli oppression of the Palestinians is not going to let up anytime soon. So I strongly suspect we're going to be back. It'll be probably a different. Who knows? Who knows what the trigger will be? But it'll be back again. The question is, does this sort of outrageous sort of smearing of students as anti-Semites and faculty, including Sadi, you and me, and Karim, I'm sure, all of us and all our sort of colleagues who speak out on behalf of Palestine as anti-Semites, this constant smearing machine, is that going to continue? Is the gasoline going to keep being given to it to keep the machine going?
yeah. By the way, Osama, it's no longer smearing. I mean, back in the day when people were accused of being anti-Semitism if they criticized colonial Zionism or Zionist racism or whatever, then it was a smear. But as you know, what Zionist institutions have done for the past several years, to greater or lesser degrees of success, is they've weaponized this concept of anti-Semitism now, and they've turned it into a legal mechanism. And what they're pushing very, very hard through the U.S. Congress, which of course, as usual, is as pliant to any orders coming from Tel Aviv as possible. And so what they're pushing there's a series of laws now that they're pushing that will basically make it illegal to criticize Israel in the U.S. Essentially. I mean,
Columbia University have just issued this. Now, I don't know if this is going to actually happen or not, but all incoming students
and faculty.
and presumably staff are going to be given a mandatory training that conflates criticizing Israel and Zionism with anti-Semitism. It's beyond, actually, it's beyond belief that is going to proceed as such. I mean, so the point to answer Karim's question is that these are the desperate attempts to shut down and police debate and to crack down on speech that is actually ultimately not just free speech, it's also speech that is about freedom and liberation and equality. Is that going to succeed? I don't know. I don't think so. That's my sense. I don't think it's going to succeed.
It's not.
But we'll see.
No, it's a sign. It's a sign of total panicky, sweaty desperation. If you're trying to outlaw speech, like literally to make it illegal to criticize Zionism or the state of Israel in the U.S., you like gets the like then what else is there after that? It's not going to work, right? And it's because this goes back to Kareem's earlier question: has the narrative changed? Yeah, the narrative has changed because 10 years ago they didn't need to ban criticism of Israel. 20 years ago that was unthinkable. Like, why would you? The Zionists were in control of the larger narrative that filtered all the way down, because people weren't questioning the narrative, and that now they've lost control of the narrative, and so now there's like, well, we'll shut down. Yeah, I've said this many times. Having lost all the arguments, they've gone to war against argument itself.
And Karim, I don't know if this is your experience outside in Europe, for example. Like the Zionists here, they no longer they have no intellectual or ethical argument. They no longer, the only thing they keep saying is everything is anti-Semitic, and as Sadi is saying, they weaponize feelings, they weaponize their sense of identity, and they're with Israel, and they're sort of, without ever once even thinking, well, what does it mean to say that, I support Israel, even if Israel means the oppression of the Palestinians? And it's like they never put one and one together. And so the question I have is it different, Karim, in Europe? You're in Paris right now, I think. Is it different? What's your sense there with your discussions with the Europeans? Do you think there's a shift there, a generational shift there as well, or what?
Because it's illegal to a certain extent to criticize, right? I mean, that's both in France and in Germany, I think. I don't know about other places, but.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak with any authority, and I think we should probably get somebody on to talk about the European scene a bit. But from just anecdotally, from what I can see, there's definitely protest. I mean, I know in Paris, the Sciences Po, there was some big, there was a lot of demonstrations, student demonstrations, and so there's a lot going on. And even though in different parts there's kind of laws against certain forms of demonstrations and certain form of speech, even in Germany, they're mobilizing against. So there's increased, attempts to push back on these kinds of formal authorities, and I think this will grow in Europe and elsewhere as politics just becomes more and more polarized. But I think we need to kind of get somebody to talk about that with a bit more authority on this. This is just anecdotally, and I mean, it's interesting you're talking about the question of being told that you have to, what is it you said, sign some document saying that you're not anti-Semitic. Is that what you'll have to do?
Columbia there's going to be indoctrination now when you enter Columbia University. They're going to put you through an indoctrination, and I'm sure that this is coming to other universities.
It'll come.
But now you have to basically be told that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised if this ends up traveling to places like American universities in different parts of the world. There's already a process of vetting that takes place, and there's a lot of different kinds of interferences like this. So eventually, these kinds of things will may well lead to.
Are you now, or have you ever been an anti-Zionist? And that's the world we're in right now. It's kind
okay.
of
So in the meantime, guys, there's been another kind of big development where and of course as the genocide continues in Gaza, and as the kind of the mayhem and the attacks and the pogroms kind of proceeding in the West Bank. Now there's sort of a lot of media attention on Lebanon, on the potential for war in Lebanon. And just a couple of days ago,
more war, because there already
more
is
war. Yeah, but sort of a much wider, let's say a much wider war, in which the UK Telegraph newspaper kind of came up with a report, basically an Israeli hit piece, a couple of days. Well, it could be Israeli or UK intelligence, one or the other, kind of a hit piece, basically claiming that the Beirut International Airport is being used it's not just controlled by Hezbollah, but that it's being used to receive heavy weaponry and stored inside the airport itself. And they kind of quote, supposedly, of course, what they call whistleblowers. So of course it's all unsourced, and then they had one source who was from IATA, the international the aviation agency people,
the Air Transportation Agency.
So they quoted someone there.
Air Transport Association.
Yeah,
air
and then these guys immediately came out and said, "No, this is not true. We have nothing to do with this. We're nothing." So they had to pull that source out. So there's basically nothing, no sources, and a lot of it is just not credible. But of course, what this did is it kicked off a very big kind of discussion outside and inside Lebanon. So immediately the Israelis were for AIPAC in the US, and then the Israeli politicians themselves kind of immediately moved in and started to say, you see, here, in fact, I'm reading in a statement, the IDF, the Israeli army said, quote, Hezbollah's strategy to hide weapons and operate from civilian neighborhoods stems from its intentions to draw the IDF to target these civilian areas in times of escalation. If Hezbollah were to target Israeli civilians from these sites, the IDF would have no choice but to react, potentially placing Lebanese civilians in harm's way, causing international outrage. So this is clearly the kind of the Israeli modus kind of operandi, where they plant these kinds of stories. They say, okay, at the airport, Hezbollah has weapons, has storing kind of major weapons, things like this. It won't take long before they say, you see, something's coming out of Beirut airport. So when they attack and destroy the Beirut airport, they're going to say, you see, there's weapons there, just as they did in Gaza with all the hospitals, the Shifa hospitals, various kind of the whole story with UNRWA in Gaza as well, saying that UNRWA was riddled with Hamas kind of operatives. So that enabled them and gave also their Western allies in the media, and the liberal media gave them a lot of possibilities to kind of justify the attacks at the hospitals in that case, and eventually will justify the attacks at the Beirut airport with all the, you see what's going on, Hezbollah controls the airport, so therefore it's a legitimate target, it's not really a civilian. And if civilians happen to die in the process, well, that's, what can we do?
Human shields. Human
shields, they're being used there. So there was a big kind of outcry, and there's a big battle going on, in the newspapers. And it's interesting that so the kind of the Israeli kind of UK front is kind of easy to analyze and understand, because they've been doing this for so long, this kind of thing where they plant these kinds of stories in order to justify a potential attack, in the days or weeks or months to come, possibly, as though the Israelis need any kind of justifications. But perhaps with a genocide, they need to kind of clear the path a little bit ahead of time. But what's also happening, and it'd be interesting to kind of talk about this a little as well, is it kind of kicked off another round of kind of infighting within the Lebanese politics and Lebanese politicians and pundits and media. So, the kind of right-wing, the anti-Hezbollah people have come out very strongly. Of course, Hezbollah denied, the Lebanese government strenuously denied all this. The Lebanese Minister for Transport took a bunch of journalists and media people to the airport, I think yesterday, to kind of show them around, to show that there's no massive boxes, there's no big storage units, etc. But of course, I find that fairly useless, because it's not really about the reality; it's about the image that gets constructed, and so the narrative basically that allows Israelis that the reality becomes not so important, and so I don't think it really. But the point is, there was this massive denial that at all levels at the official Lebanese level, but those that are against Hezbollah in Lebanon, including some of the officials in the Lebanese forces, the Kada'a party, and on some of the TV stations like MTV and others, have all come out either quoting the Telegraph as though this was a factually correct kind of story, or saying, well, whether or not it's true, and they literally say that it may or may not be true, whether it's credible or not credible is not the point. We all know that Hezbollah controls the airport and they have weapons there, and this is drawing Lebanon into the war, and we blame Hezbollah for anything that might happen. So of course they understand that the Telegraph article is bullshit, but they have been in a sense triggered to kind of come out and add further to this for internal reasons and internal consumption, to kind of add to this kind of anti-Hezbollah tension that's taking place. And so now you have this mix of the outside and the inside that are clamoring to kind of blame Hezbollah for not only what's been going on and for dragging Lebanon into war, but for future potential war that might escalate and hit Beirut and Beirut airport and kind of escalate in a much wider kind of way. So this is what's going on. I mean, there's a lot to kind of unpack, and we probably should have a whole episode just on Lebanon. But
well, my first instinct, Karim, is to ask you and remind our viewers and listeners, but also just to ask, does Israel actually even need an excuse to go into? I mean, every single time Israel bombs Lebanon, they bomb, or invades Lebanon, they bomb the airport. It's not like they need an excuse. They do it all the time. So that's point number one. They did it in 2006. They didn't plant a story about the airport in 2006. They did it before, I'm sure, right? And they did it in 1982. They've done it a million times. They've bombed the airport. In fact,
The late
1968,
1960s. The
1968,
1960s,
1968.
they destroyed the airport, and they blew up all the.
They destroyed 14 aircraft, including, here I am, belonging to Middle East Airlines, the civilian airliners. These are Israeli commandos, the brave Israeli commandos, going in and literally blowing up the civilian fleet of Beirut Airport, allegedly in response to an attack that took place on an El Al plane in Greece, of all places, and had nothing to do with Beirut Airport. By Palestine, the UN, in fact, and the US, by the way, and France. The UN Security Council 262 condemned the Israelis as a premeditated military action in violation of its obligations. I mean, so that's the 68 sort of UN that was still grappling with, and Kenny, we've talked about this many times, grappling with the whole third world sort of liberation movement and the shift in the UN. Today's UN, I doubt, would actually even condemn anything the Israelis do. Right. So the question is, why do you think they would even need to plant?
It doesn't condemn the destruction of all the hospitals. But here's a question for you. I mean, it sort of goes back to what you're both saying.
No, sorry. Just to interrupt. I mean, let's be clear. I think pretty much at 98% of the levels of the UN, they've been condemning the Israelis and what they've done in Gaza and what they've done in different parts. Let's be clear. Even the Secretary General and the vast majority of Security Council members have also done it. I mean, we're talking about a veto, and we're talking about in a couple of levels, but for the most part, all the special rapporteurs, including we've had two special rapporteurs here, so on our podcast, that is. So there's been a lot of condemnation at the UN.
No. I mean, yeah, because someone was referring to the UN Security Council. That's what I meant. The Security Council, because of course, the US will veto anything that's critical of Israel, obviously. But the question is, like, why do they need these? Why do they still cling to these narratives? Like somebody in Tel Aviv thought, well, we have to prepare the way to do this thing, so let's plant this story in the Telegraph. So what? But the thing is, like all those stories about the hospitals in Gaza, they began with these stories, and then they kept the advice. I mean, the evidence they showed was so risible. That wall calendar which had days of the week. I mean, it was laughable. Why do they bother with this crap? That's what I don't understand about them. There's something.
But you guys have said it. You guys have said it. We spent the first 10 minutes, 15 minutes talking about what's going on in LA, and so you guys have already answered. You're saying the mainstream press laps it up, it uses it, it distributes it at the elite level to all those that want to hang on to it, to the liberals that you write about a lot, and it gives them this sense of, yes, now we can understand why it's justified. So they're putting it in, so that later, even legally, they can say, you see, we already warned them, we've already said so, the evidence was there, they didn't clear out from the airport, so therefore we had no choice but to hit the airport.
I don't think it'll work. I think the narrative on Lebanon is always different from Palestine. So in other words, because Lebanon is technically, formally a state, so the idea of Israel assaulting another state is going to be, I mean, of course, leaving aside what's happening in South Lebanon now, which is always considered to be like a different planet from Beirut. But the idea of if the Israelis attack Beirut airport, they have no legitimacy anymore. I think they've lost the legitimacy war in terms of this kind of the story with Lebanon. It's very difficult because it is very difficult for them to justify to the international audience the assault on Beirut airport. I really think that's point number one. So whether they plant the story or not plant the story, I mean, obviously I think they planted the story in the Telegraph. It's sort of almost irrelevant, it seems to me, Sadi. I don't know, Karim. It's I don't see it as, or maybe they're preparing the way. Or go ahead.
But just before you get to your second point, because this is important, I think it's not. I mean, I'm worried less about do they need to do this in order to attack, which clearly they don't. I think they do it. I think there is a bureaucracy. There's a machine of employees that do this kind of thing, and that's their job.
You mean propaganda?
They do this.
You mean propaganda?
So that happens. Yeah, it's a propaganda machine that happens. I mean, regardless of the actual military things, the military is very happy to have this, but it doesn't need it. But it's kind of happy to have this kind of chugging along, and so do the lawyers at a certain extent. But it's if you look at the other dimensions, it's not so much will they attack, because if they attack the Beirut airport, you're talking about war, expansion of war. It's not. There's no such thing as attack the Beirut airport. That's it. Because if they attack Beirut airport, Hezbollah will surely attack Ben Gurion airport, and so this stuff will. The days where the Israelis can attack the Beirut airport, like the late '60s, like in the '80s, like 2006, those days are over, where it's just a one-sided affair. That's the whole point of the kind of deterrence that kind of happened basically after 2006. What's interesting here is to think about that they're using this and these leaks as part of the negotiation to not so much to go to war necessarily, but to come out with a resolution in which they can gain something from it. So by doing this, they're also giving the internal Lebanese opposition to Hezbollah a lot of things to kind of hold on to as well, and a lot of international newspaper coverage as well. So it adds to that mix the kind of general anti-Hezbollah politically.
Karim, since you're our sort of our man on the spot,
local.
Our man on the spot,
the local guy.
Yeah,
I can talk about
locals, so to speak. The question I've always, I mean, who cares? Like, so that there's a right-wing Lebanese opposition, it doesn't make any difference whatsoever in the sense that Lebanon is deeply divided. The right wing has said absolutely nothing. I'm assuming nobody says anything about the fact that the South is being pummeled and has been pummeled for months and months and months. All the focus is on the Israeli settlers.
No, they blame. No, they blame Hezbollah for dragging Lebanon into war, which is not our war.
But they're going to blame Hezbollah no matter what, and Hezbollah has already made that calculation in how they prepare and how they mobilize and how they act. Correct. So in other words, they've already made the calculation that this group is undependent, you can't rely on. Correct or not?
I don't think Hezbollah made the calculation. I think they don't care either, and that's part of their problem. That's part of the problem if we want to look at it in Lebanese politics more generally.
Who are you talking? Who's the they now? Doesn't care about the right wing. We shouldn't call it right wing because they're all right wing, but
about any of the opposition in Lebanon that's against their having weapons and they're deploying weapons without formal official approval by the government. I'm not sure Hezbollah particularly cares.
That's what I'm saying. So what does it matter?
It's not. It's
not in the function. What does it matter that these anti-Hezbollah sort of groups in Lebanon? What does it matter what they say? Because in the end, it's irrelevant to how Hezbollah is operating.
Oh, you build pressure. I mean, it's about building pressure. It's not going to topple Hezbollah. Hezbollah is not going to be toppled from the inside. But the idea is each side kind of contributes what it can do from its own resources and its own stand. You need to have local pressure in order for those on the outside.
Yeah, but Sadi, what I see.
No, it's not. I mean, there's a legitimate discussion to be had in the internal Lebanese politics. The issue is that when you're in the middle of a war, and these things come out in this particular moment, it's adding layers of pressure to Hezbollah, which allows the internationals to kind of say, you see, in Lebanon, there's a lot of anti-Hezbollah thing, and in Lebanon, they're blaming Hezbollah for the war. So it's an echo.
No, I agree. It is an echo chamber. What I see is the pressure in Israel is vastly greater on the Israeli government than on Hezbollah in the Lebanese scene. If you see what I'm saying, like the Israelis have waged a genocide against Gaza. They've slaughtered. They've massacred. And it's true that the vast majority of the Israeli Jewish population is in favor of more genocide, right? That's Karim, isn't that all the polling data tells us this? That whatever it is, they're overwhelmingly in favor of more slaughter and more killing in Gaza, allegedly to teach the terrorists a lesson, so to speak. But the point is that they haven't achieved their military, and we keep debating this, they haven't achieved their military objectives. They haven't achieved it.
It's not a debate.
Okay. Right.
It's not debate.
Well, except unless you think
simple,
as I do, unless you think that the destruction of Gaza itself is the objective and the making of the place uninhabitable.
We're talking about the stated military objectives. Their stated things was to destroy Hamas and retrieve the hostages by any
exactly.
By any means
so they have not achieved those things, although they have destroyed and devastated life in Gaza and made it hell. On the northern front, with Lebanon, for example, they not only have they not achieved anything, they're actually in a terrible situation, an unprecedented situation for them. They are, for the first time, as Hassan Nasrallah said the other day, in his last speech, where he said that for the first time in history, the security zone is not just on the Lebanese side; it's on the Israeli side for the first time ever.
That's hugely important. Hugely important. It's hugely important, and that's part of the deterrence. Where you have, it's interesting. You have around 90, I think 95,000 Lebanese displaced from sort of the southern Lebanese villages in the border. You have over 100,000 Israelis that have been displaced and sent back, and it's been now 9 months, and they're now clamoring. There's another lobby group to kind of clamor to either attack Lebanon or to reach a deal. But there's a kind of because these people, their school year has ended and they don't know where they're going to start the schools, etc. So it's the first time you have, as I said, this kind of that it's taking place on both sides, and that's part of the deterrence.
But let's be clear for all our listeners and our viewers. I mean, they know this, I'm sure, already. When you look at what the Israelis have done to southern Lebanon, the devastation is vast compared to the devastation. I mean, Hezbollah doesn't have that same capacity to devastate the north of Palestine. They don't. I mean, what they've done is they've displaced the Israelis, but they haven't reduced it to rubble.
No, they haven't, because they've been striking primarily military targets.
Their strategy has been to hit military infrastructure. They're not going after civilians. They've displaced it as far as they're concerned. A goal would have been to displace the civilians, and they've done that. So they're not targeting civilians because they know if they do, in a sense, in the so-called rules of the game, that would be a huge kind of crossing of a red line, because Hezbollah has never really targeted civilians. So if they suddenly
but the Israelis, but Karim, correct me if I'm wrong, have the Israelis not targeted Lebanese civilians?
Yeah, because that's all they know how to do.
There's been at least 100, I think, killed.
I thought so. How does that? So what are the rules of the game, so to speak? You can target our civilians, but we can't target your civilians. Is that the rule of the game? Just so I understand what we're talking about.
No, that's not. That's why there's this kind of, there's been this pressure on Hezbollah in from different circles, and there are some red lines that have been crossed, and that is this notion that if Lebanese civilians are killed or at least targeted, then so will Israelis, and that hasn't happened really, because.
So what do you mean by that? But you just said that 100 Lebanese civilians have been killed.
Yeah, so it's this kind of equivalency of if you displace here, we're going to displace there. If you hit Beirut Airport, we're going to hit Tel Aviv Airport. So this kinds of equivalencies, which was set up and outlined by Hezbollah vis-a-vis the Israelis, has not been applied in the sense of with Israelis clearly targeting and killing civilians. It has not been reciprocated, and that's not because Hezbollah, I mean, at least from what I know, it's not because they don't have the capabilities per se. It's because strategically and tactically, they've not made a decision to do so, because if they do so, they know that's going to lead to a major escalation, which they have not wanted to do. So the Israelis have crossed that red line, and in this particular case has not responded in this way. But there comes a point where if something major happens, then they will probably feel like they have to respond. So there are some certain red lines, strategic red lines that can't be crossed, and there's some other red lines that are obviously a bit more fuzzy in the sense of if it interferes with the larger strategic or tactical red line, then they won't necessarily respond immediately.
But what they have done is they've by hitting all of those Israeli military installations along the north of Palestine. They've all the radars, all of the listening posts, all of the antennas, all of the surveillance equipment. The Israelis are completely blind to the north, which is why Hezbollah could then send those drones over into northern, all the way through Palestine, all the way down to Haifa, and say, "Look, we can see everything, and here are your launchers, here's this, here's that." So here's the question:
and they've done this, but Sadi, this is this is what they've done precisely in retaliation or as part of the kind of what the Israelis have started to leak that they're going to attack Lebanon, etc.
It's what was known in the Cold War as mutually assured destruction. But here's the thing: do the Israelis understand it? So this is. I mean, my worry as an observer now is that the Israelis, they don't seem to understand much of anything, as far as I can tell. And I don't know. I mean, it seems very, very clear if they've lost all of their radars and their stupid Iron Dome doesn't work, or its launchers get knocked out. And anyway, they need radar to function, etc. They're completely vulnerable to a heavy missile attack. In other words, if they go full scale in Lebanon, up to wherever, Saida or Beirut or the airport or what, the infrastructure or whatever, on a large scale, they will get they won't be the same in terms of scale, but they'll certainly get a pretty big dose of counter violence. And so the question is, do they get it?
There's two things. One is, maybe Karim's right, that this is all about sort of posturing and trying to improve their negotiating position vis-a-vis Hamas and vis-a-vis Hezbollah. In other words, this is all about...
You mean threatening?
Yeah, the threatening to go to war, as opposed to actually going to war, because they understand that there's a huge cost to be paid. So that's one question we need to think about. The business of basically the Israelis, are stuck, as we say, in Gaza. They're slaughtering, but they're not achieving their political objectives. They want to quiet down, so to speak, in a genocide. I'm not sure what that means, but they want that front to stabilize to an extent where they can keep killing and murdering and massacring, but not at the intensity that they've been doing, to relocate some forces to the north. That's my understanding, as part of this whole shit. So they want, right?
They've done that. They've announced it. I mean, Netanyahu announced it. He said they're going to wind down.
Whatever that means, they're killing 20, 50 people a day. I mean, so I'm not sure what winding down means to them.
He's going to be going to America, so they're going to so-called wind it down, so that it gets off the major media. So when he goes to America, he's there triumphant. He gets his standing ovations. And the threat is, they can't invade Lebanon, as I understand it. They can't, if they want to even go with the threat of it, even if they don't want to, but even if they threaten to it, they have to stop in Gaza.
But they can't stop in Gaza.
Redeploy. But
he's put himself in a box, because if he stops in Gaza and Hamas is still there, then he's lost. I mean, so that's why the Americans are.
But he's lost. He's lost.
I agree.
However you slice it, he's lost.
I agree.
That's the worrying part. If he's lost there, then he may need something else.
So that was my second question to you guys. Don't you think the Israelis are, other than assuming, okay, our assumption here is that this is all bluff and intimidation, and the usual Israeli belligerence vis-a-vis Lebanon, and all the Palestinians and all the Arabs, the way the Israelis always deal with their neighbors, which is to brutalize and threaten them, and threaten to send them back to the Stone Age or whatever they say. Those are the threats. But let's just say, in the unlikely scenario, Karim and Sadi, that it goes to war, an expanded war, because as we keep saying, there isn't a war going on. I mean, the Israelis are bombing Lebanon every single day. And the question then is, don't you think the Israelis are relying on bringing the Americans back in? So that for the first time, the U.S. will be engaged, since 1982 at least, engaged in bombing Lebanon. 84, after 82, in other words, sorry, 83, 84. It was 83, 84, actually.
Yeah. I mean, so one possibility here is Netanyahu's primary concern, of course, is for himself. I mean, he's a consummate politician. His number one interest is his own himself. The legal difficulty he's in and so on, and the political difficulty he faces. He's completely stuck in Gaza. He's not accomplishing, other than just inflicting massive harm. He and his countries, they're not accomplishing anything in Gaza, right? They're not, all of their objectives are failing. Their army is getting battered in Gaza too, in between killing civilians. But so if he stops there, as you're saying, he's lost. And then, then the knives are already out for him anyway. So he's doomed. And so one possibility for him then is to say, okay, well, now we're going to expand the war to the north. All of this blather that he's been saying about the U.S. isn't giving us enough weapons, they're slowing down the supply. I mean, this petulant little child of a state telling its daddy, "Hey, we want more weapons." I mean, it's unbelievable to see it. I mean, it's anyway. All that is also to put blame on the U.S. for not giving them enough weapons, even though they've dropped, what is the figure, 78,000 tons of explosives, 5 or 6 Hiroshimas, basically, more explosives than were dropped on London and Dresden and Hiroshima and Hamburg, all these other firestorms of World War II, and yet but the possibility is then he's going to expand the war in the north in order to postpone the inevitable, basically to keep it going for as long as possible, to save himself. Essentially, that's possible. It would be irrational politically, militarily.
I think that's the only possible explanation. Yeah, I think that's only possible.
Saving his own bacon, basically. Not saving it. It's deferring the inevitable. I think at the end he's doomed one way or the other. But It's what they keep saying on the on the various Arabic news programs, but الهروب إلى الأمام, running, escape to the escaping forward rather than backwards.
Running away from the
I don't
problem,
know.
basically. Running away from inevitability is basically what it is.
Yeah, yeah, by deferring and deferring and deferring and deferring, and then
But
hoping that
don't you
the
think,
U.S.
but
will
Sadi
come
and
in
Karim, don't
and
you think
save
that
him.
there's a real risk that if this goes into, and there is going to be a war at some point, a larger war, because from the Israeli sort of security sort of logic and political logic of the Iron Wall, they can't have Hezbollah there for inevitably for forever. It's intolerable for them, especially what's going on in the north of Palestine. They just can't, in northern Israel, they can't accept this. So, and Karim, you've said this oftentimes, that there is eventually going to be this wider regional sort of, showdown, and Hezbollah is prepared for this. Don't you think the Israelis are going to rely on the Americans, and we're going to have the Americans actively involved? So, just like what you see in Gaza today, for the first time in my knowledge, and Karim Sadi, correct me if I'm wrong, it's the first time the U.S. is actively involved in killing Palestinians, as they were involved in the Nusayrat massacre, right? They've been giving the Israelis not just weapons. They were coordinating the entire operation, were they not?
Yeah, but they weren't. As far as we know, they didn't have boots on the ground.
We don't
So
know.
they're
Right?
indirect.
I mean, we're told that there are special operations, special forces, blah, blah, blah. But even more so, the coordination is more intense than it's ever been. Is that not right? And it's perceived to be anti-Palestinian, which the Americans.
Yeah, but here's the thing, Osama, the thing is, what the U.S. can offer the Israelis is more of what the Israelis already have, which is aerial
No, and
bombardment.
intercepting
The
drones and
U.S. is not
intercepting
going to send.
missiles.
I don't know about that. I'm not sure about that, but they're certainly not going to send in ground forces.
I mean, the first thing that happened after October 7th is the Americans sent in an aircraft carrier,
Yeah,
and that was on the assumption that was to deter Hezbollah, because that was on the assumption that Hezbollah would destroy the the military airfields of the Israelis. So they'd also have the aircraft carriers in which they could come in and land and take off, and all this kind of thing. So yes, the Americans will
so
add.
that's what they bring to the table is more bombing.
Yes, but in other words, it mitigates from all the targeting that Hezbollah will have on Israeli targets. They'll be able to use American facilities to refuel, to kind of renew, etc., on the assumption that Hezbollah is not going to attack American ships and American infrastructure. So, it extends it. It's a bit like now in Gaza, where the Americans keep supplying and resupplying and resupplying through weapons, and if they did not do so, the war would have ended a long time ago, and there wouldn't have been the kind of genocide.
The point is, the Israelis' problem is not bombing from the air. They're very good at that because it's easy for them to do because there's basically no air defenses.
Could they have done this in Gaza if continuously, if the Americans were not keep supplying them?
So, yeah, no, obviously, yeah, the supply comes from the U.S., but the point is having another 100 planes capable of bombarding targets. That's not the issue of the Israelis.
It is the issue. I'll tell you why. Sorry to interrupt, but I'll tell you why it's an issue.
I think the issue is on the ground. They're incapable of fighting. That's the issue. And the
That's
Americans aren't
true.
going to help.
But what has changed is that Hezbollah has now, it's shown, and I think it's not quite clear how much, but it's shown that it has now, for the first time, it's showing it has anti-aircraft or anti-drone capabilities. This is the first time the Israelis are being, at least since the 70s, is being challenged in the air. So even psychologically, when they don't know what Hezbollah has at this point, or what they've been supplied with, the idea that the Israelis, which ever since I've been born, the Israelis go back and forth with their planes and nobody can do anything to stop them. This is the first time that they at least have to think about it, where they know that Hezbollah has, at least we don't know how much, but a certain number of anti-aircraft kind of missiles and drones and things that can do some damage to their absolute air supremacy, and that's huge. That's huge. They don't have, I don't think, a massive amount, but they have enough to kind of add to
Keep the Israelis guessing.
to keep them thinking. This is the part of the psychological war, which Hezbollah is very, very effective in. And this is part of, as I said, if we go back to the beginning, to the Telegraph article, I think this is part of this whole psychological warfare that's taking place, where people are ratcheting up pressure, they're throwing in stories, they're trying to test each other out in order to kind of come out with a sense of, no, our deterrence won, and the other guy says, no, our deterrence won.
Yeah,
and
but
the question becomes,
but
can
still,
you return to a? Yeah.
That's true, but on the other hand, what the U.S. brings to the table, if it brings anything at all, I mean, there's this new aircraft carrier they're positioning in the Eastern Mediterranean, But so what they bring is more aircraft and more bombs. But as I said, that's not the Israelis' problem. I mean, theoretically, yeah, maybe they're going to be restrained a little bit because there's the possibility of an area of anti-aircraft defense, maybe, but nobody knows to what extent and so on. And anti-aircraft defense is very, very complicated because usually it takes radars and it needs layers. And there's all kinds of complications to it, so it's not clear. But other than that, if there's actual fighting on the ground, this is not an army that's capable of actually fighting on the ground. We've seen that from 9 months in Gaza. They're not capable of
And in
fighting,
2006.
I know, but now the point is, if at one point, for example, they had a preponderance in armored vehicles, the anti armor missiles that both Hezbollah and Hamas are using are very, very effective. And so that's no longer like a trump card that the Israelis have.
I don't think
that they
the
used to
Israelis.
have,
Yeah,
right?
so I agree with you. I don't think the Israelis. I mean, and also the army's been fighting for now 9 months in the genocide in Gaza, and it hasn't. It's exhausted too, right? I mean, there's also this. You can take the same
They've
people,
taken very
send
heavy
them to a
casualties.
much more
Yeah, I mean,
capable Hezbollah. I just don't see that happening. Honestly,
plus it's a reserve army. This is like these people they've already been dismissed. Are you going to recall them again? These people like in their 30s and 40s who are shattered and
yeah, but I
exhausted.
think
They're not,
we need to sort of
I don't know.
segue at this point to the end, because we're getting to the hour mark that Karim always reminds us is our sweet spot. The question is, Karim and Sadi, like in terms of going up one more level in terms of U.S. diplomacy. I was listening to a show yesterday, and somebody, I don't remember who it was describing U.S. policy basically as being essentially taking everything off the table. This kind of horrific Biden administration. There's, because of their committed Zionists and their ideologues from Biden to Blinken and so on and so forth, they've taken all the pressure off the table vis-a-vis Israel. And then they keep asking Israel to stop doing certain things. But for Netanyahu, there's zero pressure on him. I mean, what's the pressure? There's internal pressure.
No, the internal pressure.
There's internal pressure. I get it. But he's more adept internally than Blinken and Biden are. And so my question is, from the beginning, they've said, there are no red lines. So how do you put pressure?
No, they keep saying no. There are red lines, but then every time the Israelis cross the red line, the Americans draw another red line further away. So obviously,
Maybe whatever it is, but there's clearly no consequences as far as I can tell. There are no consequences, and so it's. I don't understand how the U.S. is operating in this sort of what the point of. I've never seen. I guess what I'm saying is I've never seen a more incoherent U.S. policy position, unless the policy position is
because the people in charge range from feeble-minded to committed Zionists.
it's got to be more than that.
Yeah, if you want to be charitable about it, the Biden administration had only one policy that they wanted to push through in this entire period, and that was to extend Trump's kind of plan to normalize and to bring in the Saudis. So they have to extend the Abraham Accords and kind of conclude a Saudi-Israeli deal, in which case there would be, then, the Palestinians, etc., all that stuff would have been resolved within that kind of paradigm. They still want that. I think they still want. I don't think it's going to happen, but I think they still want that to happen before the elections. So there is an incentive for the U.S. for this, just for political reasons, for there not to be a war in Lebanon, for example, because that was simply, that would just make everything that complicates everything for them. Yeah, I'm talking on a purely political level.
Especially a war with American involvement.
They've leaked it all over the place that they've told the Israelis that they will staunchly support them if there's a war, but they will not be involved in any way in a battle against it. But they've leaked that and they've made that abundantly clear. They're not going to do any boots on the ground or any direct war in Lebanon or Hezbollah or with Iran or any of this kind of thing. I think they've made that clear, and that's their way of telling Israelis, "Don't. We're going to support you, but don't do it." They don't have an incentive from the American side. There's no incentive to expand it. They don't really care about Gaza. They don't care about Palestinians in general. They do care about the Saudis. They do care about having a normalization deal, and they do care about not so much. They don't care about the war. The war will prevent them. The slim chance of having a deal with the Saudis will disappear.
You mean the war? You mean the expansion of the war in Lebanon? That's
in
what you
Lebanon.
mean?
Yeah, I think that will kill even the small hopes that they have of concluding a deal with the Saudis. So at least there's an incentive. So rationally speaking, there is an incentive there. And for whatever they leak, I'm sure they're communicating this to the Israelis. The problem is that Netanyahu is in his final stint. He's been dominating Israeli politics for, I don't know, 2 decades, 3 decades, I don't know. He's been there a long, long time. And he's kind of dominated politics there for a very long time. So he's on his last stint. So his personal interest is not the same thing as the Israeli state interest, or certainly not American interest. So he has a very specific part. The question is internally, among the generals, among all these people, will they be able to restrain him? And do they understand if he's bluffing? So I can understand the bluffing and the whole Israeli thing of bluffing, which they like to do and they do a lot of. That's why I still don't think there's going to be a war in Lebanon, because I think these guys are the masters of bluffing and huffing and puffing. But it doesn't mean that at a certain level there can't be a war. There can be.
You mean an expanded war, Karim? Yeah,
an expanded war. So the war in South Lebanon is very real. As I said, there've been hundreds of people killed or wounded among Lebanese civilians. A lot of infrastructure. 100,000. I think it was around 100,000 people displaced. And this has been for
third of the agricultural land burned by white
the
fire.
burning, the burning of forests, of agricultural plots and lands. All the stuff is designed by the Israelis to, in a sense, their plan, and we've known this actually from very early on, and it's something they wanted to do before, but now they're trying to implement. Sama, you talked about Gaza, which is they're trying to do that same plan for the 3 to 5 to 10 really up to 5 kilometers off the blue line, what's called the blue line, sort of the border area. They want to render that area, so nobody can go there at all. That's their hope. So when you come to a resolution, the kind of expanded resolution of 1701, that kind of thing, there would be no one.
It's not going to work.
Hezbollah, but no civilians even allowed back into it, because it would have been totally, utterly destroyed. Of course, it's not going to work. There's no way.
If they had to resort to building trebuchets to burn the land on the Lebanese side,
it's incredible. Those pictures were amazing. Those pictures were out of Game of Thrones or something. It's really incredible.
Well, I mean, we've always said it's an anachronism, and so the anachronism uses anachronistic weaponry.
And just as we were wrapping the news, we were getting the news now that Julian Assange was just released and is, I think, on his way to Australia, which I think is it's one little bit of good news in a pretty dismal moment in the world. What do you guys think of that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank God he's been released, and honestly, it's been a travesty. His persecution for being a journalist, and in the West that constantly gives lectures to the rest of the world about the sanctity of journalism and the sanctity of freedom of speech. But we all know how it works.
And for those of our listeners and audience who don't remember the story that put Julian Assange on the map, I mean, I'm sure he's done many things, but the thing that everybody kind of latched onto was I can't remember what year it was. I know it was after the American invasion of Iraq, through Chelsea Manning. Chelsea Manning basically gave video files to WikiLeaks, or to I don't know if it was to Julian Assange personally, but whatever, to WikiLeaks, which he then posted.
2006, WikiLeaks was
2006, that famous video. So the video that shattered everybody's shattered into everybody's awareness of American conduct in Iraq was a video of which WikiLeaks posted of an American helicopter gunship systematically attacking a group of civilians, including 2 photojournalists, but there were other civilians there, systematically, mercilessly slaughtering them. And of course, the U.S. thing was, no, these were armed terrorists and this and that and insurgents and all, and then, obviously the video completely disproved the American claim. And from that moment on, first of all, Chelsea Manning went to jail herself. And then secondly, they've been after Julian Assange, 2006 or like 2022 or whatever years since then. I mean, that's what put Julian Assange on the world map. And of course, everybody in the world should be indebted to Chelsea Manning for leaking that information, and to Julian Assange for making it possible, available to the rest of the world too.
And we'll add a link to the WikiLeaks thing in the bio of this episode.
Yeah. Anyway, one little bit of good news in an otherwise dark moment in world history. Bye.
Bye, guys.